Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming on this beautiful day at sea on the Viking Star. I don't know about you, but this has been one of my favorite days so far. All right. There was a time when politician was not a dirty word. It was an ideal. Every citizen was expected to take part in the life of the city, of the polis, as the Greeks call it, and to be a politician, and not, as the ancient Greeks said, an idiot. I'll explain that later on. I'm a retired American Foreign Service officer with more than 36 years in the State Department, serving in South Asia at first, and then 25 years in the Middle East. Twice an ambassador, in 2004 to the Republic of Yemen, nominated by George W. Bush, and in 2011 to the Kingdom of Bahrain, nominated in 2011 by Barack Obama. That's me with the Crown Prince of Bahrain, His Royal Highness Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa. He's a very decent guy, actually, very smart, educated at American University in Washington, D.C. Mostly, though, I was a guy in the trenches, working on the ever-elusive Israeli-Palestinian agreement, the strain of U.S.-Iran relations, the misguided hubris of our Iraq policies, the tragedy of Yemen, the demand for Kurdish justice, and the Shia-Sunni divide in the Gulf. Easy stuff. Not a lot of progress, not many celebrations, too much violence, and too many wars. It was not a smooth ride, but I learned a lot about the resilience and the basic goodness of people that made more terrible the failures of their inept and corrupt governments. I learned about the huge and sometimes awful impact of religion, and I learned about the universal, desperate, and too often unrequited desire for justice. I learned the precious value of good government and the right to choose one's government and to hold it responsible, the value of democracy. We owe the Greeks a lot. Most of us in Europe and the Americas were taught that Greece was the birthplace of Western civilization. There's poetry in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. There's art, pottery, and sculpture. There's drama with Sophocles and Euripides, and architecture in the Parthenon, and mathematics with Pythagoras and Euclid. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. I mean, where else would we get a word like hypotenuse but from the Greeks? But one Grecian idea stands out for me as a former diplomat and a representative of the United States of America, and that is democracy. All the countries that we'll be visiting on this trip, or we already have visited, are democracies, genuine ones, with warts, problems, challenges, some of which I outlined in my first lecture, but all of them are reasonably stable democracies. Indeed, there are more functioning democracies in the world today than at any time in history. But what is democracy? And there's no better place to begin than at the beginning. Greece, specifically ancient Athens. Demos, the people. Kratos, power. Power to the people. Imagine that. The people have a say in how things are run, an idea that sprouted in ancient Greece, bloomed brilliantly, but briefly, and then it died out, mostly. Democracy was not to appear again for almost 2,000 years, when Jefferson, Adams, Washington, and Madison, among others, found that ancient seed in the philosophy of Locke and Rousseau and Voltaire and propagated it anew. After Athens, even the word democracy was scrupulously avoided by some of the most progressive and liberal thinkers and writers who preceded the Americans and influenced their political ideology. It was considered too dangerous to let the mob have much say in government. Better to leave it to the educated elites, to the enlightened men, almost always men, who knew best, and to God's anointed ones, kings, emperors, and tsars. That same debate had roiled ancient Athens too. Democracy meant power to the people. The question was, and always has been, which people and how much power? And who among us has the right to participate, to vote, to decide? Fundamental to democracy in ancient Greece was the right to speak out and debate the issues, to participate, to peacefully assemble, to petition the government, to elect the government, to vote. These are familiar concepts to us today. Even though the ideology of democracy was discredited and weakened after the Athenian experiment, hints of it can be found with the Romans and their Senate, however diluted by autocrats and Caesars. And in England's Magna Carta and its demand that all men are subject to the rule of law. The democratic idea was nourished by parliaments in England and France and by the Polish Sejm, however clumsily they pursued it. And in the end, governments are responsible to the people they govern. If they fail to see that, they fail. Maybe not immediately, maybe not peacefully, but they fail. I've seen that. I believe that. Again, I'll say this a couple times during the lecture. Today, democracies flourish all over the world, in larger numbers than at any time in history. Some are under siege right now. Others are just setting down their roots. But as a system of government, there is no better. At least, it's better than anything else we've tried, said this very wise man. I love quoting Winston Churchill. I think most public speakers do. He's just so damned quotable. He said, no one pretends, and I can't do his voice, I wish I could, no one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. But let's go back to the Greeks, to the ancient Athenians, the first democrats. Democracy reigned in Athens from about 600 to 320 BCE, roughly, with periodic bouts of oligarchy, or the rule of the few. But from the defeat of the tyrants, as they were called, and they were not all bad, until the establishment of the Macedonian kingdom and Alexander the Great, Athenians were ruled by a democracy, about 250 years, almost equal to the lifespan of the current holder of the world's oldest democracy, the United States of America. Athens was the largest city-state in Greece. There were approximately 300,000 people living in Athens and its area. Of only 100,000, one-third of them were citizens. To be a citizen, you had to be the child of a citizen father. You had to own property. You had to have served in war. A foreigner could gain citizenship by heroic service in war. All male citizens had to undergo military training. There were long wars against the Persians and the Spartans. And to vote, you had to be a man. There were about 30,000 adult males who were citizens with voting rights. So out of 300,000 people living in Athens, about 30,000 have the right to vote, 10%. Did I do that right? 10%. The remaining citizens were women and children. Again, only men could participate in the assembly, no women. Athenian women, including citizens, had limited rights. No formal education. They were segregated from the men. They were not allowed out in public. They stayed at home to cook and care for the household. They were very jealous of the Spartan women who could own property, walk in public, participate in daily physical training with men, although they, like most Spartan men, had no political rights whatsoever in autocratic Sparta. To convene an assembly a quorum of 6,000 citizens was necessary. A citizen had to be present, physically present, to vote. And there was only one polling place, and that's the Panax, a hillside near the Acropolis in Athens. There would be speeches pro and con about the issues: war, taxes, criminal and civil trials, grants of citizenship. And after the speeches, there would be a show of hands, and monitors in the crowd would estimate which argument won. For sensitive or important issues, the citizens in attendance would take a colored pebble, I'm not sure which color, red for yes, black for no, say, and they would drop the pebbles into large clay pots, and the pots would then be smashed open and the pebbles counted, so you had a more exact count of the vote. Again, only for sensitive matters. And let's consider one famous decision of the assembly. I'm sure you've all heard of it. The trial of Socrates. Accused of blasphemy, failing to worship Athens' gods, and the moral corruption of youth, making them into political skeptics and cynics, Socrates was a brilliant teacher and orator. If you've been to law school or if you've studied philosophy, you're probably familiar with the Socratic method of asking questions and never giving answers. The unexamined life is not worth living, Socrates was reported to have said. He wasn't a writer, so we don't have much record of his words, but he was reputed to be often critical of the leaders of the assembly. He had a biting wit, and perhaps most damning, he had been suspected of support for the 30 tyrants who had ruled Athens for only a few months after a defeat by Sparta in 404 BCE. Socrates was not a democrat. He preferred rule by the enlightened elite, according to Plato, who was his most famous student. At his trial, 500 jurors out of the 6,000 at least present on the Panax were chosen by lot to hear the case against Socrates. And he was convicted by a very small majority. He thought he'd only be fined, but instead he was condemned to death by drinking hemlock. He was given a chance to flee the city, and it was expected that he would flee, but he didn't. He refused, and he died a martyr's death. His trial and other questionable decisions by the assembly helped speed the creation of a court system in Athens with elected judges who had some experience in law. Many educated Athenians, including Plato, seriously doubted the wisdom of allowing what they called the mob to decide important matters, like criminal cases. Another reflection of Athenian democracy that resonates with me, and I think some of you in the audience as well as New Englanders, are what we call the New England town meetings, and they may occur elsewhere in the United States as well. I'm from Groveland, Massachusetts. It's a small town just north of Boston on the Merrimack River. There are about 3,000 residents in Groveland, and once a year there were town meetings, and any adult man or woman could attend. The attendees, and you had to be present, like the Greeks, you had to be there to vote, would elect a board of selectmen, and they would vote on a variety of issues before the town. Things like whether to buy a new snowplow or a police cruiser, or expand the library, purchase land for a new elementary school. I don't think many of them were aware of the roots of the New England Town Hall meeting in ancient Athens, but I was immediately struck by it. Back to 400 BCE, the Athenian assembly also elected a council to handle daily issues, mostly administrative and financial. Counselors were limited to two-year terms. Some were chosen by lot, according to which tribe or family they belonged to. You had to be at least 30 years old. There were no other requirements for citizens, although, as is the case in law, there quickly developed a need for greater expertise in financial matters, military strategies, and other areas. Interestingly, only rich citizens who owned property could be in charge of finance or tax collection. It's not that they were any more trustworthy or less likely to pilfer from public funds, But in the case of embezzlement or loss, the assembly could then go to the rich estate and recoup the funds that were lost from the public coffers. Defeated generals could be tried and punished by the assembly. The assembly could also decide on reparations and retribution regarding defeated enemies. And these were often draconian and brutal measures, including the massacre of all males and the enslavement of women and children. Enlightened members of the assembly were often appalled at this and considered it to be ill-advised and counterproductive. The handling and mishandling of war was one reason that democracy was criticized by influential folks like Socrates, Plato, and later on Aristotle, and eventually discredited and abolished. They questioned whether the common man, the mob, was qualified to make decisions on war and peace. The best speakers often had the most power. They formed cliques, kind of like political parties. Votes were sometimes traded, sometimes bought and sold. Any citizen present on the panics could propose a law. It could be only in that citizen's own self-interest. Didn't matter. There was a lot of concern about corruption. There were bad decisions on finance. There was exorbitant payments to office holders. Powerful members attacked opponents frivolously, and revenge against defeated enemies, as I said, could be severe and counter to the best interest. There were many questionable decisions made by the citizens on the panics. Many qualified citizens avoided participation in the assemblies, and these men were called idiots, which meant simply a private citizen who did not take part in the public vote. So the good citizens were politicians, and the bad ones were idiots. It's funny how words evolve. Now, sometimes they couldn't get 6,000 citizens to show up on the panics for a vote. And so for important decisions like going to war or granting citizenship, slaves would go out into the marketplace and literally rope in citizens from the nearby place using a red-stained rope. And if your robe was stained red when you entered the panics assembly area, you would be fined, presumably because you had to be herded in and did not participate willingly. Finally, the assembly passed a law authorizing payment to citizens who participated in the assemblies. And then they had the opposite problem. Too many would show up, so after 6,000 they would rope off the rest of them and they would only pay the 6,000. By the way, jumping up to now, the issue of compulsory voting is still very much an issue in many places around the world. In Australia, and I know we have some Australians in the group, you can be fined up to $170 if you do not vote. In Belgium, you have to at least show up at the polling place, even if you decide not to vote. And if you don't show up for 4 elections, you can be fined and lose your voting privileges. I think it's mostly Americans on the ship, and most of us know that to enforce voting in the United States or impose requirements on voting, most of those have been struck down as unconstitutional. The right not to vote is seen equal to the right to vote, and consequently, participation in U.S. elections, even national ones, is often below 50% of eligible voters. In the last British parliamentary election in 2017, a respectable 66% of voters showed up, and in Canada in 2015, 68% voted. So perhaps we Americans need to rope in a few more citizens into the polls. Of course, elections in themselves do not denote democracy. They're not always reliable. In 1995, I was a political officer in Cairo, and we were trying to monitor the presidential election there. It was a straight-up referendum on the longtime president Hosni Mubarak. Citizens had to vote in order to claim their ration card for that year. It was a card that allowed them to buy subsidized flour and cooking oil at cheap prices, so it was very valuable to many, many Egyptians. All you got to do was vote yes or no. Mubarak was the only name on the ballot. Yes for him, no against him. And in the embassy on the day of the election, we had about 20 analysts who fanned out to various polling places in Cairo to report on the election so that we could write our reports back to Washington. Not a whole lot of people would read them. They knew who was going to win. When I showed up at the end of the day into the offices of our analysts, they were all sitting around and laughing. And they said that they had had a competition to see how many times they could vote, who could vote the most times, and I was confused. Maybe you've seen this. When you vote in some of these countries, they stain your finger with indelible ink so that you can't go and vote twice. So I said, how is this possible? And Ahmed Ali, one of my favorites, he said, I win the competition. I voted 8 times, 7 yes and 1 no. The no was his last vote, and that's when he got his finger stained. As long as he voted yes, he can vote as many times as he wants. I think there are some American candidates who might like that system too. No, consequently, Mubarak won, I think, with 98% of the vote, a landslide. Back to ancient Athens, just for a minute. As I've mentioned a number of times, a lot of very influential thinkers, they criticized Athenian democracy, calling it little more than mob rule. Plato wrote that the organization of the city must be confined to those who possess knowledge, who alone can enable their fellow citizens to attain virtue and therefore excellence by means of education. Plato blamed the assembly for the execution of his teacher, Socrates. He believed in the existence of ideals, perfect objects, perfect systems, perfect institutions. And the Athens assembly, he believed, was a very poor reflection of a perfect government. Another great philosopher, Thucydides, who was also a historian of the Peloponnesian War, was extremely critical of the assembly after Athenian losses in the war. And he blamed the assembly for electing incompetent generals and for punishing good ones for political reasons. In his view, war was too important to be left to Democrats. And no smiles from Republicans in the audience, please. Aristotle wrote about what he considered to be a better form of government than democracy. Rather than any citizen partaking with equal share in the rule, he thought that those who were more virtuous should have greater power in governance. There were natural leaders and there were natural slaves. On this chart, if you look at the red box up in the upper left, Aristotle thought the best form of government was a virtuous and enlightened ruler, a king. The worst was democracy, down in the lower, mob rule of the poor. And he discovered the most famous natural leader in Greek history when he was chosen to tutor the eldest son of Philip of Macedon, who was then engaged in subduing the city-states of Greece, including Athens, and enlarging his kingdom at the expense of Athenian democracy. And Aristotle's pupil, of course, was Alexander the Great. There were other factors that led to the collapse of Athenian democracy: the weakening of the assembly as its members became more exclusive, the rich and powerful prevailed, it's an old story, and they pushed the common masses out. There was a period of oligarchy ruled by a few, preceding Philip of Macedon's forceful uniting of Greece in 340 BCE and beginning Alexander's conquests of Persia and beyond. But let's move on with democracy, at least what remains of it over the next 2,000 years. First, to the Roman Republic, the res publica, which means of the public. It doesn't mean by the people, for the people. It's just of a very few people. Dr. Livingston's lecture goes much deeper into Roman history and into the Republic, so I recommend it, if you didn't see it earlier today, to watch it on the television later on. The Roman Empire roughly was from 509 BCE to 27 BCE until the Roman Republic, rather, until the establishment of the empire under Augustus Caesar. And the Romans had completed their conquest of Greece by about 146 BCE, except for Alexandria, and that waited until Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Now, the Roman Republic was never remotely a democracy. There was constant war with Carthage, Egypt, and the Gauls. Generals became the most powerful individuals, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and Pompey and Octavian, who became Augustus Caesar. The Senate, the Roman Senate, did survive throughout this history, but it was never a powerful institution. Under Augustus and his heirs, it was little more than an advisory body at best. It was often dissolved, and its members were ridiculed, exiled, or worse. One emperor, the infamous Caligula, even appointed a horse to be senator to show his contempt for the Senate. But the Roman ideal of a Senate did survive, and it was resurrected by the Americans in 1780 when the U.S. Senate was established to act as a balance to the mob rule of the House of Representatives. The Senate would advise the president, consider all laws proposed by the lower house. Well, in theory, anyway, it was designed to be a group of wise men and now wise women. I'm trying to set up just a few historical references of what we think of as the roots of democracy before I get to democracy today. I mean, there's Athens, the Roman Senate, for better or worse, and this one, which is vital, and that's the Magna Carta. The short document established the bones of what we know now as the rule of law, the revolutionary notion for 1215 that no man or woman was above the law. King John signed it only reluctantly and under duress. His nobles simply wanted to codify their own rights. They didn't care about the masses. And so the Carta was not a declaration of universal human rights as it's sometimes described today. It was very limited in scope, but it challenged, for the first time, the divine right of kings. It was almost immediately repudiated. It was subsequently resurrected, amended, used in various arguments against the king's right to rule, and it really did herald the end of monarchs and their God-given realms. It's a seminal document in the establishment of the British Parliament and in the American Bill of Rights and Constitution. But how do we go from kings and emperors to the representative governments that we know today? And thinkers like Rousseau, and Voltaire, and Locke all wrote on the rights of man and the limits of rulers. None of them favored democracy. Again, they were elites, and they feared mob rule, the rabble, commoners, revolution. They were closer to Plato and Aristotle, ruled by the enlightened elite, the educated, liberals. During this long democratic dark age, there were a few limited attempts at representative government. I spent a few years in Poland in the 1980s when they were under the thumb of the Soviet Union and a very repressive government in Warsaw. But in Poland in the 1700s, there was a brief outburst of democracy. The Polish parliament, called the Sejm, was elected by a small number of qualified, mostly wealthy nobles, who then elected the king. The parliament's decisions were extremely hampered by a process known as the liberum veto, by which any member of the Sejm could veto any proposal. There had to be unanimous consent to pass any measure. So you can imagine how much was done. Nothing. And the outsiders, the Russians, the Swedes, and the Austrians, took advantage of this weakness, and the Sejm didn't last very long. Russia and Austria soon carved up the country between them, and Poland's so-called liberals were exiled. By the way, that's what my name means in Polish, Krajeski. It means one who's been sent to the border or one who has been exiled. It also means countryman or patriot. It's a great Polish name, but it's hardly rare. There are about 3 pages of Krajewskis in the Chicago phone book, and a whole lot of Poles throughout history had been exiled. Now to the next act, and perhaps the greatest act, forgive me, I'm an American, perhaps the greatest act in democratic history so far, the formation of the United States of America. Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison, Adams, Franklin, they're all influenced by the great thinkers of the Enlightenment who spoke on the rights of men. They're influenced by the Roman Senate and by Athenian democracy. And they revive for the first time in 2,000 years, the discredited idea of democracy and debate. And they talk about what power to the people really means and how that power can be used for good and how it can be balanced and controlled. They were not entirely successful. Much work still needed to be done, but the seed of rule of law that was planted in the Magna Carta blossomed in Jefferson's rousing, simple statement that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain rights, among them which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These few men created a Senate, a Roman-style Senate, to balance the Commons, the House of Representatives. They decided on a president, no king. Washington refused a throne and a crown when it was offered to him, and he insisted on being called the lowly title of Mr. President, never Your Majesty. They established a Supreme Court to rule on matters of constitutionality of laws, and they wrote a Bill of Rights, the first amendments to the Constitution that guaranteed basic political and human rights to Americans. All great, but in fact the first documents of this new nation really only included less than half of its citizens and residents. Only white males, no women, slaves, or foreigners, it sounds familiar, could vote. Black African slaves had no rights at all. Women's rights were severely restricted. It's been a long, hard road for us Americans, but we've improved things slowly, I think, and we're still on that road. Democracy, at its best, is a work in progress. As Churchill said, it's not a perfect system by any means, but it's better than anything else we've tried. The British parliamentary democracy slowly developed its truly representative body while gradually limiting the powers of the throne, and mostly without violence or revolution, Cromwell notwithstanding. And the modern British parliamentary system, whatever its state today, has been the model for many of the world's democracies. All right, it's enough political history. What's the state of democracy today? All right, the USA is the longest running democracy since Athens. And in fact, as I've said already, there are more democracies in the world today than at any other time in history. Every country that we're visiting can lay claim to the title. Spain, France, Italy, Greece, and Croatia, although Croatia is still developing. There are many different variants. There are parliaments, and there are senates and congresses, presidents and prime ministers. There was an idea common at the beginning of this current century that democracies do not go to war with each other. It's not exactly true, but it's mostly true, and it's a good thing to keep in mind as you're promoting democracy around the world. Building democracy is always hard, and it often goes wrongly in ways that we don't expect. Most of my diplomatic career was in the Middle East, where, frankly speaking, democracy has never flourished. The region's history doesn't have many examples of democratic experiments. It's been an area ruled by autocrats, dictators, strongmen, emirs, and kings for a long time. Perhaps only Israel can be described as a true democracy, but it remains a transplant, well established, but it's hardly surrounded with like-minded governments. In 2011, in the so-called Arab Spring, it did not result in the blooming of democracy in the Middle East, as we and many citizens of those countries in the Middle East had hoped. I've been posted in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, and Bahrain, all of which experienced political demonstrations and turmoil in February of 2011. Tunisia, where the first demonstrations began in 2010, is still holding on. Its democracy is fragile, but elections the parliament is still holding together. Egypt has reverted back to military rule, perhaps even more oppressive than before, and Bahrain, where I was last, remains a kingdom. All political opposition has been outlawed and dissolved, and the leaders are in jail. Most discouraging for me, Yemen, Syria, and Libya sunk into brutal civil wars. Yemen is particularly painful to me. It's a beautiful country. When I was ambassador in Sana'a, 2004 to 2007, we supported then a period of relative peace in Yemen, the first fair, it's a relative term, presidential election in that country's history. The president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had won previous so-called elections easily, usually with 98% of the vote, agreed grudgingly to allow an opposition candidate to campaign openly without harassment. The candidate was not a very strong campaigner, and his support was weak. And when the results were in, Saleh found that he had won the election with only 75% of the vote. He was furious. He called me up, called me into his office, and sitting there scowling at me, he accused me of trying to undermine his authority and of deliberately humiliating him with this election. Now, I had known in advance that he would do this, so I had my staff find and print a copy of the front page of the Washington Post from November 7th, 1984, an election we probably remember. The headline read, "Reagan wins in landslide. Greatest victory in U.S. electoral history. Garners 60% of the vote." And I turned to Saleh, showed it to him, and I said, "A landslide, Mr. President. And you did better than Reagan." Saleh smiled. He said, "Better than Reagan?" And I said, "Yeah, you bet. Better than Reagan." There we are. That's diplomacy at work. And then there's Iraq. God, I look silly. Oof. And it was not a silly time. The defining issue of my diplomatic career, for better or worse, was Iraq. In 2001, when I returned from Dubai in the Persian Gulf to take a job in Washington as the deputy director of the Iran-Iraq desk at State Department, my main portfolio was to have been Iran because of my work in Dubai, which is where we have all of our so-called Iran watchers. We have no embassy in Tehran since 1979. I was pretty excited about this. But, and I think others in the audience will share this, 9/11, 2001 changed my life, changed my job dramatically. Our focus in that office became Iraq and the replacement of Saddam's government in Baghdad with a hopefully more benign and friendly one. Now, I won't, in this lecture, go into the details of the policy debates that raged in Washington and elsewhere in the year before the Iraq War, 2003, except to say that I wish state leadership, including Secretary Powell, had been more forceful in their opposition to the use of military force. That's for another lecture, or maybe a discussion in the lounge later on or up back. I want to talk about the immediate aftermath of the invasion and the overthrow of Saddam, and our ongoing efforts to help Iraqis build a more democratic government. It's been uneven, diplomatic word at best, but it was a major factor in the decision to invade that country. There were some in the United States government who were convinced it would be a relatively simple task, and that it would resonate throughout the Middle East to begin the end of other repressive governments in the region. These people were wrong. It has been exceedingly difficult for us, and especially for Iraqis. In the first few months and year, we were determined to help in the creation of democratic institutions, a parliament, courts, and a free media. We thought if we could get a constitution written by Iraqis, hold elections, elect a representative parliament, then the rest of democracy would fall in place. We were wrong again. A constitution is necessary, perhaps, but more important is the rule of law. Elections are terrific, but they have to result in an effective and representative Congress. We discounted, almost fatally, the importance of other factors in Iraq that bubbled to the surface when Saddam's regime and its security forces were defeated. Security in the country collapsed. Bitter ethnic rivalries erupted. Sectarian religious violence flared across the country as a struggle for power that was thick with revenge and retribution was waged by Iraqis among themselves. An insurgency sprouted, and terror increased as a weapon of one group against another. We were not prepared, and we were even unwilling to recognize these developments as they took place. I recall sitting with a large group of mostly Sunni, and that's the majority group of Muslims, but it's the minority in Iraq, where the Shia, the other major Islamic sect, is the majority. But I was sitting with a group of men and women in the city of Tikrit, which happens to be Saddam's hometown, shortly after the war had ended, and we were talking about the formation of new political parties, drafting a constitution, and holding regional elections with these Iraqis. And one man interrupted me. He said, all this is good, but what we need is security. We're afraid to visit the markets because of the bombs. We're afraid to let our children, especially our daughters, go outside for fear they'll be kidnapped. We're even afraid to pray in the mosques on Friday. You Americans, you came into our country and like flicking a fly from your forearm, great phrase in Arabic, he made the gesture. You got rid of the most powerful man in our lives, Saddam. And now our streets are not safe, our schools are closed, there's no electricity, the markets have no food. I don't understand. Why haven't you fixed these things? I want democracy, but I need security and electricity. I sat quietly for a moment, and I said, you have to be patient with us. We don't overthrow governments and replace them often. We really don't know how to do it. We're learning. Be patient. And it was not the answer that he wanted, and we should have had a better one for him. But as I look at Iraqi democracy today, there are the purple fingers. It's not a complete disaster. The parliament still functions. They have just, with outside help, expelled the Islamic State, ISIS, from Iraq, and now it has been defeated in Syria. ISIS terror will continue, but in Iraq anyway, it's diminished. There is reason to hope in Iraq. When America finally declared war on Germany in 1917, Woodrow Wilson told Congress that the world must be made safe for democracy. And however misguided or mishandled, that was our intention in Iraq. Without security, democracy is hard. It's maybe even impossible. And getting the balance right is the tough part. When does the basic need for security override the basic freedoms that are needed to maintain a democracy? In an all too rare example of cooperation between America's two political parties, the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute around the world have worked together in many countries to build and strengthen democratic institutions. Many other NGOs from the United Nations, from the United Kingdom, from Europe, devote millions of dollars, thousands of hours to the same end. Democracy is under pressure in places like Venezuela and Turkey and Hungary, as powerful men who are first elected then choose to coerce the system to give themselves more power. Political opponents are insulted, vilified, thrown in jail. Newspapers and broadcast media are restricted and closed. Internet access is curtailed and narrowed, and elections are rigged. According to Freedom House, a U.S.-based and supported NGO, 2018 was the 13th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. The reversal has spanned a variety of countries in every region, from long-standing democracies like the United States to consolidated authoritarian regimes like China and Russia. The overall losses are still shallow compared with the gains of the late 20th century. But the pattern is consistent and it's ominous. Democracy is in retreat. Nevertheless, the promise of democracy remains real and powerful. Not only defending it, but broadening its reach is one of the greatest causes of our time. It's not one size fits all. There's no set rules and laws. There's no single recipe for success. As I said, elections are important, but they're not the first thing, and they don't guarantee a democracy. A parliament is only effective if it can act. A constitution is only good if it's defended and followed. I think there are two main requirements for a successful democracy, and they both go back to ancient Athens. Freedom of speech and assembly. Every citizen must be free to speak her mind and gather peacefully to petition the government. And rule of law, as first declared in the Magna Carta 800 years ago, no one is above the law. There must be equal justice for all. And that to me is democracy. That's power to the people. Thank you.